Some brides get diamonds. Some brides apparently get roadkill on wheels. The words landed before the truck's engine had even finished ticking, before Wade Sullivan had unbuckled his seatbelt, before the September sun had fully cleared the marble columns of the Ritz-Carlton Dallas. Derek Hayes said it loud enough for the valets to hear, loud enough for the string quartet warming up near the fountain to hear, loud enough for it to ride the wind straight through the open window of the old Ford pickup and land square in Wade's chest like a fist. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The laughter came a half second later. It always did. Laughter needed permission, and Derek had just given the whole crowd permission to point. Wade sat there a moment longer than he needed to, one hand still on the wheel, the leather cracked and soft under his palm the way it had been for 11 years. Through the windshield, he watched the valet boys exchange a look, the kind of look people gave a stray dog that had wandered into a wedding it clearly wasn't invited to. Beyond them, parked under the portico like a throne on wheels, sat a Rolls-Royce Phantom the color of fresh cream, its paint throwing back the morning light so hard it hurt to look at directly. He looked down at his own hands instead, calloused. A scar across the left knuckle from a chain that had snapped loose on a flatbed outside Amarillo back when he drove nights to make rent on a room he shared with two other men he'd never learned the last names of. He'd worn the same brown work boots to this wedding that he'd worn the day the bank finally stopped calling. Some habits didn't leave a man just because the money did. He stepped out. The gravel under his boots sounded wrong here too. Honest for a place built entirely out of hushed carpet and hushed money. Kayla Carter stood by the Rolls-Royce in a gown that had probably cost more than Wade's first 3 trucks combined, and she was already laughing behind a gloved hand, her eyes bright with the particular cruelty of someone who had never once had to wonder where her next meal was coming from. "Oh my God," she said, not lowering her voice at all. "Please tell me this is a joke. Please tell me my sister's fiancé did not drive a 1998 Ford to his own wedding." "Some men," Derek said, tapping the Rolls-Royce's roof the way a man pats a good dog, "know how to arrive. Others just show up." The guests near the entrance laughed again, softer, this time the kind of laugh people gave when they wanted to seem above it but couldn't resist. Somewhere in that crowd of pressed suits and diamond cufflinks, Wade caught sight of a woman standing very still. Emily Carter. She wasn't laughing. She hadn't laughed once. His chest did something strange when their eyes met, a tightening low and unfamiliar, like a rope pulling taut around something he'd buried a long time ago. But before he could hold on to that feeling, Robert Carter came down the front steps, like weather rolling in his face, already dark, with the specific fury of a man whose reputation was worth more to him than his own daughter's happiness. "Wade." Robert's voice cracked across the courtyard. "What in God's name is this?" Wade turned to face him, and for one unguarded second, something old surfaced behind his eyes, not fear exactly, but the ghost of it. The particular flinch of a man who had once stood in front of a lot of angry men holding clipboards in eviction notices a man who had learned a long time ago in a trailer park outside Waco, with a roof that let the winter in through different seams, that when a man with money raised his voice, the smartest thing you could do was lower your eyes and wait for the storm to pass. That instinct rose in him now unbidden before the newer version of himself. The version with 1,100 trucks on the road and a company worth more than this entire hotel could push it back down. "Good morning, sir," Wade said quietly. Too quietly, maybe. His voice had the same soft, careful register it used to have when he was 19 years old, asking a foreman if there was any chance at all, of picking up an extra shift. "Where is your family?" Robert demanded. "Where is your convoy? Where is anything that tells me you can take care of my daughter?" "This is how I came," Sir Wade said. "It's the truck I own." Someone near the fountain laughed outright at that. A bright, ugly sound, and Wade felt it hit somewhere below his ribs, somewhere that 11 years of success had never quite managed to armor over. He had promised himself a long time ago, standing in a laundromat at 2 in the morning, watching his last $20 turn into quarters, that he would never again let another human being make him feel smaller than he was. And yet here he stood. Diane Carter appeared at her husband's shoulder, dabbing at nothing under her eyes, though there were no tears there yet. "Emily," she said, not even looking at Wade, as if he were furniture that had wandered onto the wrong lawn. "Emily, sweetheart, please." Look at your sister's car. Look at the life waiting for her. Now look at this, she gestured at the truck, without finishing the sentence, as if the sentence finished itself. Emily stepped forward. The morning light caught the simple cream dress she wore plain compared to the ocean of sequins around her, and something in the set of her shoulders reminded Wade sharply, painfully of a version of himself he hadn't let anyone see in over a decade. The version that used to stand very straight in unemployment lines, refusing to let anyone see him shrink. "I am not ashamed of him," Emily said. The words seemed to travel farther than her voice should have carried. Derek let out a short laugh and leaned against the Rolls-Royce like it was a prize he'd already won twice over. "Beautiful sentiment," he said. "Won't put food on the table, though. Camping trip. Are we, Wade? Or is that thing actually your only car?" Something flickered behind Wade's eyes at that, not anger, not yet. Something closer to memory. A winter 11 years gone. A truck cab with no working heater, frost forming on the inside of the windshield. A body so thin the bones of his own wrist had frightened him when he looked down at them under the gas station lights. He remembered eating gas station crackers for 3 days straight, because a client had delayed a payment by 6 weeks. And 6 weeks was the exact length of time between him and total collapse. Nobody in this courtyard knew that man. Nobody here had any idea what real hunger did to a person's hands, how it made them shake, reaching for a doorknob, how it made pride feel like a luxury item you simply couldn't afford anymore. Wade said nothing. He let the silence sit there, the way he'd learned to let silence sit in boardrooms full of men who underestimated him. Men who, one by one over the years, had learned exactly how expensive that mistake could be. Robert stepped closer, his voice dropping into something colder, more final. "This wedding is off. Emily, get inside." "No," Emily said. The single word cracked something open across the courtyard. The quartet near the fountain stopped tuning their instruments entirely. Kayla's smile faltered for the first time all morning. And Wade, standing there in his work boots and his cracked leather jacket, a man worth more money than every person in that courtyard combined, a man who had once slept in the cab of that very truck to save on rent, felt something rise in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Not shame. Not anymore. Something closer to grief for the boy he used to be, and something closer to hope for the woman standing between him and the crowd, refusing, for reasons Wade did not yet understand, to let them turn her into someone who laughed too. The courtyard had gone quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet right before something breaks, not peaceful, just waiting. Robert Carter stood 2 steps above Wade, using the height of the staircase, the way certain men always used height as a small and desperate kind of armor. Behind him, the hotel's glass doors reflected the whole tableau back at itself. The cream Rolls-Royce, the rust-flecked truck, the bride in the simple dress, the crowd pretending not to stare while staring anyway. "Get inside, Emily." Robert's voice had dropped an octave, the register he probably used in boardrooms of his own back, when he still had a company worth running. Now. Emily didn't move. Her hands were folded in front of her knuckles, pale, and Wade noticed the way he noticed everything, a habit left over from years of reading rooms for danger before he could afford to read them for anything else, that she was shaking slightly, though her voice hadn't wavered once. Diane came down the last few steps in a rush of pale blue silk, her hands finding Emily's arm the way a person grabs a railing on a boat that started to tip. "Baby," she said, and her voice had gone soft, now coaxing the tone people used on frightened animals. "Baby, look at me. Nobody is saying you can't love him. We're saying think about what today looks like. Think about what people will say by tonight. I don't care what people say. You will." Diane's grip tightened. "You will care, sweetheart, when the whispering doesn't stop. When your father's business partners ask why the Carter girl married a man who showed up on a she, gestured helplessly at the truck, unable to finish the insult a second time, as if saying it twice might make it permanent. Wade stood very still through all of this. He had learned a long time ago that when wealthy people started performing their disappointment for an audience, the worst thing you could do was interrupt the performance. So he let it happen. He let Diane's voice climb, and Robert's jaw tighten, and Kayla's laughter needle at the edges of the crowd, and underneath all of it, quietly, something in his chest kept pulling him backward, years backward, into a kitchen table with one leg propped up on a phone book, to his own mother's voice, thin with exhaustion, saying, "We'll figure it out, baby. We always figure it out, even on the nights when they hadn't figured anything out at all, when the lights had gone out anyway." When he'd done his homework by the glow of a gas station sign 2 blocks from their trailer, because it was the only light he could steal for free. He hadn't thought about his mother's voice in years. Not really. not the way it came back to him now, standing on hotel gravel in boots that cost less than the flowers on one single table inside. Robert. Wade said the name carefully, respectfully, the old instinct rising in him again, the instinct of a boy who'd learned to speak softly around men who held power over his next paycheck. I understand this isn't what you wanted for your daughter. You understand nothing. Robert's voice cracked like a whip. You understand nothing about what it costs to build something and watch your own child throw it away on a brose. He stopped himself, breathing hard, and for one strange second, Wade thought he saw something underneath the anger. Not cruelty exactly. Fear. The particular fear of a man who had spent his whole life terrified of falling, watching his daughter walk calmly toward what he believed was a cliff. Kayla drifted closer, her heels clicking against the stone, Derek trailing a step behind her like a shadow that had learned to smirk. Sister, she said sweetly. The word doing none of the work sweetness usually did. It's not too late. You could still come inside. We'll tell everyone you got sick. Nobody has to know. I'm not sick, Emily said. No, Derek said low enough that only the people closest to him could hear, just blind apparently. Wade's eyes moved to him for the first time, slow and deliberate, and something passed across Derek's face for half a second. Not quite fear, but the recognition of a man realizing too late that the person he was mocking wasn't nearly as small as he'd assumed. It was gone as fast as it came, buried under another easy smile, but Wade filed it away the way he filed away everything, quietly, precisely for later. You don't get to speak about her that way, Wade said. His voice was still soft. It was always soft, even now, even with everything he owned, everything he'd built. Some habits didn't leave a man just because his bank account changed. But there was something underneath the softness now, something with an edge to it. Derek's smile thinned but held. And what exactly are you going to do about it? Run me over with the truck? A few people laughed. Wade didn't answer. He'd learned that too a long time ago, that the men who needed the last word the most were usually the ones who had the least to actually back it up. Diane pressed her hand flat against her chest as though she might faint from the sheer indignity of the whole morning. Emily, please. I am begging you. Come inside with me. We can fix this. We can push the wedding quietly. We can say there was a scheduling issue. Mama. Emily's voice broke slightly on the word, the first crack Wade had heard in it all morning. I don't want to fix anything. I want to marry him. Why? Diane's eyes filled finally with something that looked like real tears instead of performance. Why him of all the men in this city? Why does it have to be him? Emily looked at her mother for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had gone very quiet, very steady. Because he's never once made me feel like I had to be someone else to be worth loving. The words landed somewhere in Wade's chest he hadn't expected them to reach. He looked at her, really looked the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in a long, long time, and felt that same tightening rope pull just a little tighter. Robert descended the last 2 steps until he was standing directly in front of Wade, close enough that Wade could smell the cologne, expensive and sharp, close enough to see the fine tremor in the older man's hands. Fear dressed up as fury. Wade recognized it because he'd worn that same disguise himself years ago, standing in front of men who could end his business with a single phone call. I built something in this city, Robert said, low and shaking. A name people respect, and you're asking me to hand my daughter to a man who can't even afford. He stopped again, glancing at the truck like it personally offended him. I'm not asking you for anything, sir, Wade said. I'm just not leaving. Silence again, the kind that pressed against the ears. Somewhere behind the crowd, a valet shifted uncomfortably, and one of the string musicians lowered her violin entirely, watching now instead of playing, sensing the way people always sense when a moment has stopped being a wedding and started being something else, something with teeth. Robert's jaw worked. He turned finally toward the hotel doors, his shoulders set in the particular rigid line of a man choosing pride over everything else he might have lost that day. This wedding, he said, loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear, loud enough to make sure no one mistook this for anything other than a verdict, is over. Diane let out a small broken sound. Kayla's smile returned, small and satisfied, tucked into the corner of her mouth like something she'd been saving. Emily didn't move. Wade watched her. Watched the way her chin lifted instead of dropped, the way her hands unclenched at her sides as if she'd made peace in that exact second with whatever came next, and felt for the first time since he'd stepped out of that truck, something other than the old familiar shame, trying to climb back up his throat. He felt instead something he hadn't let himself feel toward another human being in over a decade. He felt like he wanted to protect her from all of it. The crowd, her father's pride, her mother's tears, the entire glittering machine of expectation grinding down on a woman who had done nothing wrong except refuse to be ashamed of. Him. And somewhere underneath that feeling quieter, harder to name, was the first small crack in the wall he had spent 11 years building around his own heart. The crowd hadn't fully dispersed when Tommy Reyes pushed through it, cutting a straight line across the gravel like a man who didn't care whose $3,000 dress he brushed against on the way. He grabbed Wade by the elbow, not gently, and pulled him toward the shade of the porte cochere, away from the Carters, away from the whispering, away from Emily's stricken face, still turned toward her retreating father. "Wade." Tommy's voice was low, urgent, the voice of a man who had known him since before. Either of them had 2 nickels to rub together since before the trucks, before the company, before any of it. "Wade, look at me. What are you doing? Not now, Tommy." "No, now." Tommy's grip tightened. He was a big man, broader than Wade, with the kind of face that had spent 30 years being honest whether people wanted it or not. Right now that face was pale and his eyes kept flicking toward the hotel steps like he expected something to come crawling out of them. "You need to hear this before you go. One more step into this family." Wade felt something cold settle into his stomach. In 11 years of building an empire out of nothing, he'd learned to recognize the particular stillness that came right before very bad news, and Tommy was wearing it now like a coat 2 sizes too heavy for him. "Say it," Wade said. Tommy glanced over his shoulder once more, then lowered his voice further until it was barely more than breath. "Carter. Robert Carter. You know his family's been in Texas, oil and land, for 3 generations, right? Grandfather started it. Man named Walton Carter. I know the history, Tommy. I did my due diligence before I let myself fall for his daughter." "Did you do it far enough back?" Tommy's jaw tightened. "Because I did some digging of my own weeks ago after you told me you were serious about her. Habit, I guess. Old habit watching your back for you." He exhaled hard, like the next words cost him something physical to say. Walton Carter ran cattle land outside of a little town called Millbrook, about 2 hours south of here. Late 80s. He had a foreman working that land, good man by every account. Man who kept that operation running through 2 droughts and a fire that should have bankrupted the whole outfit. Wade felt his pulse slow the way it did in negotiations, the way it did right before a number on a page changed everything. Tommy. That foreman's name was Daniel Sullivan. The world went very quiet around Wade, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with sound, and everything to do with the floor tilting slightly under a man's feet. His father's name. His father, who had died when Wade was 17, worn thin by decades of other men's land, and other men's promises buried in a plot the family had to make payments on for 6 years afterward. "That's not possible," Wade said. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the shape of a memory rising up to meet them. His father, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle he rarely touched, muttering about a handshake, a deal about the Carter man, about a promise made under a live oak tree that turned to nothing but smoke and lawyers. "Walton Carter promised your father a share of the land," Tommy said. 40 acres on paper, verbal agreement, the kind men used to make on a handshake before they learned handshakes don't hold up in court. Your dad worked that ranch like it was already his. Then Walton died, sudden heart attack, 1991, and Robert inherited everything. And Robert tore up whatever understanding his father had made. Said there was nothing in writing. Said your daddy was, and I'm quoting the man I talked to, hired help with big ideas. Wade's hand found the doorframe of the porte cochere without him deciding to reach for it. Somewhere behind him faintly he could still hear Diane's voice rising and falling, still hear the murmur of guests deciding whether to stay or leave, but all of it had gone distant and thin like sound underwater. He remembered the trailer. He remembered it in a way he hadn't let himself remember in years, not the soft, forgivable memory of nostalgia, but the real one, the one with teeth. The wind coming through the seam near the back window no matter how many times his father stuffed it with rags. His mother boiling the same 3 potatoes into something that had to stretch across 4 bowls. The winter his little sister got sick and there wasn't enough for both the doctor and the propane. And his father had chosen the propane and cried about it in the truck where he thought no one could see him, not knowing his son was 12 years old and awake in the back seat watching every second of it. "He took our land," Wade said quietly. "Not a question. He took your daddy's future," Tommy said. 40 acres in that part of Texas back then, that's generational. That's the difference between the life you actually had and the life you should have had. Robert Carter built half his empire standing on ground your father broke his back clearing. Tommy's eyes were wet now and his voice cracked on the next words. "And now you're about to marry his daughter Wade. You're about to walk into that family, and I don't know if you're doing it because you love that woman or because some part of you wants to make Robert Carter watch his own blood choose a Sullivan. I need to know which one it is. Because I've followed you through 15 years of bad decisions and good ones, and I will follow you through this too, but not blind. Not this time." Wade didn't answer right away. He looked out past Tommy's shoulder toward the courtyard where Emily still stood alone now, her father's rejection still hanging in the air around her like smoke that hadn't cleared. She hadn't looked toward him yet. She was staring at the spot where her father had disappeared through the glass doors, her whole body rigid with the particular stillness of a person holding themselves together by sheer will. Something in Wade's chest twisted hard, caught between two truths that didn't want to sit in the same body at once. He thought of his father's hands cracked and permanently stained with cattle dust closing around a glass of whiskey he almost never drank, and the low broken sound of a grown man weeping quietly at a kitchen table because a rich man's word had turned out to be worth exactly nothing. And he thought of Emily's voice not 20 minutes ago, steady even while shaking, saying, "Because he's never once made me feel like I had to be someone else to be worth loving." "I didn't know," Wade said finally, and his voice had gone rough, unfamiliar even to himself. "Tommy, I swear to you I didn't know any of that when I met her." "I believe you," Tommy said. "I do. But you know now. And I need to hear you say out loud that this isn't about revenge. Because if some part of you is walking down that aisle to make an old man bleed for what he did to your daddy, that woman is going to get caught in the crossfire, and she didn't do a single thing to deserve that." Wade closed his eyes. For a moment he was 17 again, standing at a graveside in a suit that didn't fit, watching dirt fall onto a coffin his family had barely been able to afford, understanding for the first time the full weight of what it meant to be born on the wrong side of somebody else's handshake. He had built everything since then, every truck, every contract, every dollar, as a kind of answer to that day. He had told himself for years that the answer was simply never again. Never again would a Sullivan be at the mercy of a man like Robert Carter. He hadn't expected the shape that answer might eventually take would be love. "I'm not marrying her to hurt him," Wade said quietly, opening his eyes. "But I'd be lying if I said finding this out doesn't change something in me." He looked back toward the courtyard, toward Emily, and something settled in his chest, not certainty exactly, but resolve. "I need to know if I can separate the two things, Tommy. Her and everything her family did to mine. Because she deserves a man who chose her, not a man settling a debt through her heart." Tommy studied him for a long moment, the way he'd studied him 100 times before across kitchen tables and hospital waiting rooms and the cabs of trucks that used to be their only shelter from the cold. "Then you'd better figure that out fast," he said, finally quieter now, some of the fight going out of his voice. "Because that woman just watched her whole family turn on her for your sake, and she doesn't know a single piece of what you just heard. If she finds out the truth the wrong way from someone other than you, it'll break something between you two that might not be fixable." Wade looked past him one more time at Emily standing alone in the wreckage of her own wedding, and felt the old wound and the new hope pulling at him from opposite directions, each one demanding to be the truer thing in his chest. "Then I guess," he said softly, "I'd better be the one who tells her." Emily stood exactly where her father had left her, in the middle of the gravel courtyard, in a dress that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. The guests had begun to drift, not leaving exactly, just repositioning themselves into smaller clusters the way people did at the scene of an accident, unwilling to walk away but too polite to keep staring outright. Somewhere behind her she could hear her mother's voice, thin and pleading, trying to coax stragglers back inside with promises that the ceremony would resume shortly, that this was only a small delay, a family matter, nothing at all. She didn't believe it either. Wade crossed the courtyard toward her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He had wiped whatever expression Tommy's words had put on his face. She would learn much later just how much effort that had taken, and what remained was something quieter, steadier, though his eyes carried a weight she couldn't yet name. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question almost undid her. Not because it was unkind, but because it was the first thing anyone had asked her all morning that wasn't really a demand in disguise. Her mother's questions had been pleas dressed as concern. Her father's had been accusations dressed as questions. This was just a man asking if she was okay. "No," Emily said honestly. "I don't think I am." "You don't have to be," Wade said. "Not today." She looked past him toward the Rolls-Royce, still parked under the portico, toward her sister leaning against it with her arms crossed, and her mouth set in something that wasn't quite a smile anymore. Derek stood beside Kayla, murmuring something Emily couldn't hear, and Kayla laughed at it, but the laugh had gone brittle, now performed for an audience that had mostly stopped watching. "He called off my wedding in front of 200 people, Emily said quietly. "My own father. I heard. Everyone heard." She let out a breath that shook on its way out. "You know what the strange part is? I think some part of me has been waiting my whole life for him to do exactly that. Not this, not today specifically, but something. Some final public proof that I'll never be enough unless I fit into the shape he's already decided for me." She looked down at her hands. Kayla fits it perfectly. She always has. I don't think I ever really tried. Wade didn't say anything right away. He had a way of listening that Emily had noticed from the very first time they'd met months ago, now in a coffee shop near downtown, where he'd been sitting alone in the corner with a laptop and a cup of black coffee, looking, if she was honest, like any other tired man getting through his Groppelond. Tuesday. She hadn't known who he was. She'd only known that when she'd accidentally knocked his cup off the edge of the table reaching for a napkin. He hadn't been annoyed. He'd laughed, actually laughed, and helped her clean it up and asked her what she was reading and listened, really listened, like her answer mattered. She hadn't found out about the company, the trucks, the 1,100 vehicle empire until 3 dates later, and by then it was almost beside the point. For what it's worth, Wade said now, I don't think your worth was ever supposed to be measured against your sisters. I think somewhere along the way somebody taught you that math and it was the wrong equation from the start. Emily's eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to let herself cry in front of the last few guests who hadn't yet found somewhere else to look. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Something shifted behind Wade's eyes quick there, and gone a shadow passing over water. Maybe I am, he said, and didn't elaborate, and Emily, sensing the door closing on that thought for now, didn't push it open. Behind them, Diane appeared again, moving fast across the gravel with the particular urgency of a mother trying to undo damage before it calcified into something permanent. Emily. Her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. What remained sounded almost frightened. Emily, baby, please come inside. Just to talk. Just for a minute. Your father he's not thinking clearly, he loves you, he's just… Mama. Emily turned to face her fully. Did you know about all of this? Did you know he was going to do this today in front of everyone, instead of talking to me privately like a family? Diane's mouth opened and closed. I didn't think he would actually, but you knew he might. Emily's voice was quiet, but it cut cleaner than shouting ever could have. You let me walk down here in this dress knowing there was a chance my own father would humiliate me in front of 200 people rather than just tell me quietly that he disapproved. It's not that simple, Diane said, and her eyes filled again. You don't understand what it's like to build something, a name, a place in this world, and watch your child throw it away for a man in a truck. Your father built us out of nothing after his own father lost. She stopped herself abruptly, and something flickered across her face, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Emily frowned. Lost what? Nothing. Diane's hand went to her chest. It doesn't matter. It was a long time ago. Wade went very still beside Emily. She noticed it, the sudden rigidity in his posture, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she didn't understand it yet, and there wasn't time to ask because Robert had reappeared on the top step, flanked now by the hotel's event coordinator, who looked like she would rather have been anywhere else on earth. Emily. Robert's voice had cooled into something colder than the earlier fury, more final. The staff needs to know whether to release the ballroom. I need an answer. Emily looked at her father, really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself look at him in a long time, past the tailored suit, and the silver hair and the reputation he'd spent 40 years building brick by careful brick. Underneath all of it, for just a moment, she thought she saw something that looked almost like fear, not of losing face, of losing her, but he didn't say that. He never said that. He said instead, this is your last chance to think clearly before you throw away everything I've built for you. You didn't build anything for me today, Daddy, Emily said. You built a scene. Somewhere behind her she heard Kayla's low laugh and Derek's murmured comment that she couldn't quite make out, and she felt something in her chest go very still and very clear, the way a lake goes still right before the surface freezes over completely. She turned to Wade. He was watching her with an expression she would spend years trying to describe afterward, and never quite manage, not pity, not triumph, not even simple love, though love was somewhere underneath all of it. It was something closer to recognition, like a man looking at someone and seeing for the first time in a long time a reflection of a choice he himself had once had to make. You don't have to decide anything because of me, he said quietly. Whatever you choose today, Emily, I need you to choose it for yourself. Not to spite your father. Not to prove a point, just because it's what you actually want. Is that what you want to hear? She asked, half a challenge, half something more fragile than that. No, Wade said. It's what I need to be true if you're going to spend the rest of your life with me. The wind moved through the courtyard, catching the edge of her veil, and somewhere in the distance a car door slammed. Kayla's probably retreating with Derek into the cool leather interior of the Rolls-Royce, done watching now that the show had stopped entertaining her. Emily barely noticed. Her whole world had narrowed down to the gravel beneath her feet, her father's rigid silhouette on the steps above her, and the quiet, steady man beside her who had just told her, in the middle of the wreckage of her own wedding, that her happiness mattered more to him than the ceremony itself. She reached out and took his hand. "I'm not going inside, Daddy," she said loud enough now for the whole courtyard, for the stragglers and the staff, and the string quartet still frozen mid-note near the fountain. "I'm marrying him. Today. Right here if I have to." Robert's face went white, then red, then very still, the way a man's face goes, still right before he says something he can never take back. "Then you are no longer welcome in this family," he said. Emily didn't flinch. She only tightened her hand around Wade's, feeling the rough, familiar calluses against her palm, and understood with a clarity that would carry her through everything still to come that she had, without fully realizing it, already chosen, and her family the moment she'd chosen him. Robert Carter's words hung in the courtyard air like smoke that refused to clear. "You are no longer welcome in this family." The event coordinator beside him shifted her weight, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, clearly unsure whether her job description covered moments like this one. Diane made a small wounded sound and reached for her husband's sleeve. Robert, please don't say things you can't take back." I mean, every word Robert said, though something in his voice had gone thin, stretched too far, the sound of a man performing certainty he no longer fully possessed. Emily didn't move. She stood in the gravel with Wade's hand still wrapped around hers, and for a long moment, the only sound in the courtyard was the distant hum of traffic beyond the hotel gates and the nervous shuffle of guests who had not yet found the courage to leave. Then, from somewhere near the back of the thinning crowd, a voice spoke, calm, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to fill a silence without raising his voice. "Robert." Pastor Sam Whitfield stepped forward, a slight man in his 70s with silver hair combed neatly to one side, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, the same man who had been standing by patiently for the ceremony that was supposed to have happened 20 minutes ago, inside the hotel's garden pavilion. He had officiated 3 generations of weddings in this city, had buried half of Robert's own business partners, and carried the kind of quiet moral weight that made even angry men pause. "Sam, this isn't the time," Robert said, though the edge in his voice had softened slightly the way it always did around the pastor. "No," Sam agreed. "It's exactly the time. Because right now you're about to make a decision in front of 200 witnesses that you cannot unmake in private later." He walked closer, his pace unhurried, his eyes moving between Robert and Emily with something like sorrow. "I've known your family a long time, Robert. I baptized your daughters. I watched you build every inch of what you have. And I am asking you as a friend and as a man of God not to let your pride cost you your child today." Robert's jaw worked. For one long moment, something in his face wavered, the fury cracking just slightly to reveal what was underneath it, something closer to grief than anger. But then, his eyes moved to the truck parked crookedly near the entrance to the work boots on Wade's feet, and whatever softness had surfaced retreated back behind the wall he'd spent his whole life constructing. "I've said what I said," Robert answered, quieter now but no less final. "If she wants to marry him, she can do it somewhere else. Not under my roof. Not with my name attached to it." Diane began to cry in earnest, now real tears finally, and Emily felt something in her own chest crack at the sound of it. Not enough to change her mind, but enough to remind her that even the family that had just cast her out was still somehow hers to grieve. Sam turned to Emily and Wade. His eyes were gentle, but there was steel underneath the gentleness. "Do you two still wish to be married today?" Emily looked at Wade. He hadn't let go of her hand once, not through the shouting, not through her father's rejection, not through the slow unraveling of everything she'd been raised to believe a wedding day was supposed to look like. His thumb moved once lightly across her knuckles, a small steadying gesture, the kind of thing a person did without thinking, out of instinct rather than performance. "Yes," Emily said. "If he'll have me exactly like this. There's no version of you I wouldn't have," Wade said quietly. Sam nodded once, satisfied, and turned toward the small cluster of guests, still lingering near the fountain. The ones who hadn't left, the ones curiosity or loyalty or simple human decency had kept rooted to the spot. "We don't need a ballroom," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "We don't need golden chairs or a string quartet. A wedding is 2 people and a promise. Everything else is decoration." He looked back at Emily and Wade. "If you're both willing, I'll marry you right here." There was a pause, the kind of pause that could have gone either way, that could have collapsed under its own uncertainty, and then quietly one of the guests began to clap. It was an older woman near the back, someone Emily vaguely recognized as a friend of her late grandmother's, her hands moving together in slow, deliberate applause. A second person joined her, then a third. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of applause that had greeted Kayla's engagement announcement months earlier. Champagne flutes raised, cameras flashing. It was smaller than that, and somehow it meant more. Robert turned without another word and climbed the hotel steps, Diane trailing behind him, her hand pressed to her mouth. Kayla and Derek were already gone, the Rolls-Royce having pulled away sometime during the shouting, its cream paint disappearing around the circular drive without either of them looking back. Emily watched her family disappear through the glass doors and felt the strange, hollow ache of losing something, even as she gained something else entirely. She had expected the moment to feel like triumph. It didn't. It felt like standing at the edge of a life split cleanly down the middle, one half already gone, the other half just beginning, and no way to walk forward without leaving something behind. "You don't have to pretend that didn't hurt," Wade said, watching her face. "I'm not pretending," Emily said. "It hurts. I just don't think it's wrong." He nodded slowly, like that answer meant something to him beyond the obvious. Sam gestured them both toward the small gravel clearing beneath the portico, close enough to where the truck was parked that its shadow fell across the makeshift altar. An unintended symbol neither of them commented on, but both of them noticed. The ceremony that followed was nothing like the one printed on the elegant cream invitations that had gone out months earlier. No orchestral procession, no flower girl, no 600 white roses flown in from a farm in Oregon. Instead, there was a handful of guests standing in loose formation on gravel, the late morning sun slanting gold across the hotel's stone facade, and an old pastor reading vows from memory, because nobody had thought to bring paper copy outside. "Do you, Wade Sullivan, take this woman?" Sam said. "Not for what her family can offer you, not for what today looks like to anyone watching, but simply because you choose her. Will you love her, protect her, and stand beside her through whatever comes?" Wade's throat worked once before he answered. There was a rawness in his voice when he finally spoke, something Emily hadn't heard from him before, not in 3 months of dating, not in the careful, guarded way he usually talked about himself. "I will," he said. "I know what it is to be looked at and dismissed before anyone bothers to find out who you actually are. I won't ever do that to her. Not once, not for the rest of my life." Emily felt her eyes fill despite every effort not to cry in front of strangers. "And do you, Emily Carter?" Sam continued, turning to her. "Take this man not for the life your family imagined for you, but for the man standing in front of you right now, exactly as he is. I do," Emily said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "I chose him before I understood what he was. I'm choosing him now, knowing exactly who he is. That hasn't changed anything." Sam smiled, the expression carrying decades of weddings behind it, and said the words that made it official, words that would have echoed off marble columns and crystal chandeliers under different circumstances, but here simply drifted out, across gravel and morning light, and the quiet applause of a dozen strangers who had decided for their own private reasons to stay. When it was over, Wade reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Emily's face, his hand lingering there a moment longer than necessary, and Emily thought, watching the careful, almost disbelieving tenderness in his expression, that whatever secrets he was still carrying, and she could feel somehow that there were secrets, something unspoken that had passed between him and his friend earlier that morning. None of it changed what she already knew to be true. She had married a man the world had laughed at that morning. She had no idea yet just how much more the world still had left to reveal. The house Wade brought her to that evening was smaller, Emily suspected, than anything she'd expected from a man who could have afforded any mansion in the state. It sat at the end of a gravel drive outside the city, ringed by live oaks, its porch light casting a warm yellow circle against the gathering dusk. A wooden swing hung from one corner of the porch, its chains creaking faintly in the evening breeze. There was nothing here that announced wealth, no gate, no security booth, no marble anything, just a modest farmhouse with a tin roof and a garden gone slightly wild along one side. "This is where you live?" she asked, standing in the driveway in her simple cream dress still faintly dusty from the day. "This is where I go when I need to remember who I actually am," Wade said. He didn't elaborate further, and something in his tone told her not to push, not tonight. Tonight had already asked enough of both of them. They ate a quiet dinner at a scarred wooden table, sandwiches, mostly because neither of them had the energy for anything more elaborate, and there was something almost sacred about the simplicity of it, about eating turkey sandwiches off mismatched plates on their wedding night, while somewhere across the city, in a ballroom full of untouched flowers, 200 place settings sat empty. It was nearly 9 o'clock when headlights swept across the front windows. Wade went still. Emily noticed it immediately, the particular stiffness that came over him, spine-straightening jaw setting like a man bracing for weather he could see coming but couldn't yet name. He rose from the table and moved to the window, and whatever he saw there drained something visible from his face. "Wade, stay here," he said, and the softness that had colored his voice all day had gone somewhere else, entirely replaced by something flat and careful. She didn't stay. She followed him onto the porch, and what she saw there made her stomach drop in a way she couldn't immediately explain. A woman stood at the base of the porch steps, illuminated by the single yellow bulb overhead. She was the gravel. Her car, a sleek black sedan, idled behind her with its lights still on as if she hadn't fully committed to staying. "Wade Sullivan," the woman said. And there was something in the way. She said his full name, slow savoring like tasting something she'd been denied for a long time. "I heard a rumor today that you got married. I had to see it with my own eyes." Wade's hands, Emily noticed, had curled slightly at his sides. "Sarah." The name landed in Emily's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't know why. She had no context for it yet, no history to attach to the syllables, but something in the way Wade said it, low and careful, told her this was not a simple name from his past. This was a wound with a name. "I'm sorry to just show up," Sarah said, though her smile suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "It's just, well, it's not every day the man who used to sleep in his truck outside the Motor Inn on Route 9 ends up owning half the trucking lanes in this state." Her eyes moved deliberate and slow over the modest porch, the tin roof, the gravel drive. "Though I see you still like to keep up appearances of the old days. How quaint. What do you want, Sarah?" "To congratulate you," she said, and then her gaze slid finally to Emily standing in the doorway. Something calculating passed behind her eyes there and gone so fast Emily nearly missed it. And to meet the lucky bride, of course. Emily stepped forward despite the tightness in her chest. "I'm Emily, Sarah Whitcomb." She extended a manicured hand and Emily shook it out of reflex, though something about the contact felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Wade and I go back. A long way back." Her eyes flicked to Wade again, and this time the smile sharpened at the edges. "Before all this. Before he was anybody at all, really." Wade's expression didn't move, but Emily saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscle jump once beneath the skin. "You should go," Wade said quietly. "I will." Sarah's smile didn't waver. "I just wanted to see it for myself." The great Wade Sullivan married at last. After everything. She let the words sit there a moment, deliberately vague, deliberately loaded, before turning back toward her car. At the door she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Take care of him, Emily. He's not as simple as he looks in that truck of his." And then she was gone, taillights sweeping red across the gravel before disappearing down the long drive, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had happened all day. Emily turned to Wade. He hadn't moved from the top step. In the porch light, his face looked older, suddenly worn in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful, guarded weariness of a man protecting his privacy, but something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like grief. "Wade." She said his name gently, the way he had said hers earlier that day when everything had been falling apart around them. Who was that? For a long moment he didn't answer. He sat down heavily on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring out at the dark line of trees beyond the driveway, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual steadiness. 10 years ago, he said, before any of this, before the company, before the trucks, before any of it, I was engaged to her. Emily sat down beside him slowly, saying nothing, letting the silence do the work of asking. "I was 26, Wade continued. "I owned one truck. One. I'd bought it used with a loan I could barely make the payments on, and I was driving it 18 hours a day trying to build something out of nothing. I slept in the cab more nights than I slept in a bed. There were winters," his voice caught and he had to stop, had to breathe once before he could keep going. "There were winters I'd wake up with frost on the inside of the windshield. So cold my hands wouldn't work right for the first hour of driving. I ate crackers from gas stations because a meal cost money I didn't have to spare. I was so thin that year my own mother didn't recognize me from across a parking lot." Emily's chest tightened, listening. She had never heard him talk like this before, not in 3 months of dating, not even once. He had always been so careful, so composed, a man who wore his success like a second skin and never let the seams show. "Sarah and I met at a diner outside Waco," he said. "I was 26 and broke and terrified I was going to lose the one truck I had to the bank before the year was out. She told me she loved me. She told me she'd wait, that it didn't matter how little I had, that she believed in what I was building." His hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists. 3 months later, I missed a payment. The bank started calling twice a day, and she left. Married a man from Houston with a house on the water inside of 6 weeks. Didn't even say goodbye in person. Just a text message and then nothing. "Wait," Emily whispered. "I don't tell people that story," he said. and his voice had gone rough, now unsteady, in a way that frightened her a little because it was the first time all day she'd seen the ground shift beneath him. I built everything I have since then like it was some kind of answer to that moment. Like if I got big enough, successful enough, nobody could ever look at me and see somebody not worth staying for again. He turned to look at her finally, and his eyes were wet, glassy in the porch light. That's why I showed up today in that truck, Emily. Not just because it's practical or because I don't care what people think. I needed to know, really know, whether you'd stay if I had nothing. Because the last time a woman told me she loved me, she meant it right up until the exact moment it became inconvenient. Emily didn't say anything for a long moment. She reached over instead and took his hand, the same rough, calloused hand she had held that morning in front of 200 strangers, and held it now in the quiet dark of a porch outside a farmhouse that had nothing to prove to anyone. "I'm not her," she said finally. "I know that," Wade said. "I've known that for months. But knowing something in your head and believing it in the place that actually got broken, those aren't always the same thing." He looked down at their joined hands. "I'm sorry for testing you today without ever telling you that's what I was doing. You deserved better than that," maybe Emily said softly. "But I understand it a little better now." She squeezed his hand. "Whatever she wanted tonight, showing up like that, it doesn't change what happened this morning. I chose you before I knew any of this. I'm choosing you now, knowing all of it." Wade closed his eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, Emily watched something in him finally quietly begin to loosen. Not fully, not all at once, but enough that she understood, sitting there in the dark with the crickets, starting up in the grass around them, that she had just been given the first real glimpse of the wound underneath the wealth. She didn't yet know that the woman who'd just driven away into the night would come back, and that when she did, she would not be alone in the damage she intended to cause. Morning came softly over the farmhouse, gray light filtering through curtains that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Emily woke to the sound of something sizzling in a pan, the smell of coffee drifting up through the floorboards, and for one disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was forgot. The wedding, the gravel courtyard, her father's voice, cracking across 200 witnesses, Sarah Whitcomb's headlights sweeping red across the driveway. For one moment there was only the quiet, ordinary comfort of waking up somewhere new beside someone she loved. Then it all came rushing back, and she lay still for a moment longer, letting it settle. Downstairs she found Wade already dressed, standing at the stove in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, flipping eggs with the easy competence of a man who had cooked for himself long before he'd ever had anyone to cook for. An older woman stood beside him at the counter, slicing bread, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, an apron tied twice around a frame that suggested decades of hard, honest work. "Morning, ma'am," the woman said warmly when she noticed Emily in the doorway. "I'm Rosa. My husband Earl and I look after the place when Mr. Sullivan's away." Mr. Sullivan. Emily filed the phrase away without quite knowing why it caught her attention. It wasn't unusual exactly, plenty of people used last names with employers, but there was something in the careful formality of it, the way Rosa said it, like a title rather than a habit. "It's nice to meet you, Rosa," Emily said. "Please call me Emily. Of course, Mrs. Sullivan." Rosa smiled, and Emily felt the new name settle strangely against her skin, unfamiliar and warm all at once. They ate breakfast at the same scarred wooden table from the night before, and for a little while, it felt almost normal: eggs and toast and easy conversation about nothing in particular. Wade asking about her favorite parts of the city, Emily asking about the garden she'd glimpsed the evening before, both of them carefully avoiding by unspoken agreement any mention of Sarah Whitcomb or the wreckage of the wedding. It was Earl who broke the illusion, arriving through the back door with a clipboard in hand, his weathered face creased with the particular seriousness of a man delivering business rather than pleasantries. "Mr. Sullivan," Earl said, nodding once at Wade, then turning politely to Emily. "Ma'am." He set the clipboard on the counter. "Malik called. Says the security detail wants to rotate the cars at the front gate before noon. Also, corporate's been trying to reach you since 6 this morning, something about the Oklahoma contracts needing a signature before the close of business." Emily's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Security detail," she repeated slowly. "Corporate." Wade's expression flickered the briefest crack in his composure before he set his own fork down with deliberate care. "I'll call Malik after breakfast," he said to Earl. His tone even controlled the tone of a man trying very hard to keep two separate worlds from colliding a moment too soon. Earl nodded and retreated back out the door, and the silence he left behind stretched long and uncomfortable across the table. "Wade," Emily said carefully. "What exactly do you do?" "I own a trucking company," Wade said. "I told you that. The night we met, you told me you drove trucks for a living," Emily said. "You didn't tell me you have a security detail." Or a corporate office calling you about contracts on a Sunday morning. Or a housekeeper who calls me Mrs. Sullivan like it's a formal title instead of a name. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, and Emily watched something pass across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Something closer to a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd been putting off for longer than he wanted to admit. I own more than one truck, he said finally. How many? 1,100, Wade said. Give or take. Sullivan Freight Lines operates in 19 states. We move about 40% of the refrigerated goods that pass through this part of the country. He said it plainly, without pride, the way another man might report the weather. I didn't lie to you, Emily. I didn't tell you everything. Not yet. Emily set her fork down slowly, her mind working backward through the last 3 months, the diner where they'd met, his careful, unassuming clothes, the way he'd never once let slip a single detail that would have suggested the old truck he'd driven to their wedding, which she had assumed right up until this exact moment was simply all he had. You said that truck was all you owned, she said quietly. It was the first truck I ever bought, Wade said. The one I drove when I had nothing else. I keep it because he stopped, exhaled hard, and something in his composure finally visibly cracked. Because it reminds me of who I was before any of this. And because I needed to know before I let myself love you completely whether you'd have stayed with that man. The one with nothing. Not the one who can call security details and sign contracts worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Emily felt something cold move through her chest, not quite anger, not quite hurt, something more complicated than either. So all of yesterday, she said slowly. The truck. The way you let my father humiliate you in front of 200 people, that was a test. Not entirely, Wade said quickly. I didn't plan any of that. I didn't know your family would react the way they did. But once it started happening, once I saw the way people looked at me the way you didn't. He shook his head. I let it happen because some part of me needed to see it through to the end. I needed to know if you'd still choose me if the whole world was laughing. And if I'd walked away, Emily's voice had gone very quiet. If I'd let my father drag me back inside, would you have told me the truth then? Or would you have just let me go, thinking you were exactly what everyone said you were? Wade didn't answer right away, and the silence that followed told her more than any words could have. I don't know, he admitted finally, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him something. I've been running from that question for 10 years, Emily. Ever since Sarah left. I built all of this. He gestured vaguely, meaning the house, the company, the 1,100 trucks somewhere out on highways she'd never see as a wall. A way of making sure nobody could ever get close enough to leave me again without me seeing it coming first. Emily stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gravel drive where, sure enough, she could now see the edge of a black SUV parked discreetly near the tree line, a man in a dark jacket leaning against the hood, watching the road with the patient stillness of someone paid to notice. Everything. How long has that car been there, she asked. Since last night, Wade said. Since Sarah showed up. Malik doesn't take chances when people from my past start reappearing unannounced. Emily turned back to face him, and for a long moment, she simply looked at him, really looked the way she had in the coffee shop 3 months ago, trying to reconcile the quiet, careful man she'd fallen in love with against the vast, hidden architecture of wealth and power he'd apparently built around himself, without ever letting her see it. I'm not angry that you have money, Wade, she said finally. I'm angry that you needed to hide it from me to find out if I was real. Do you understand the difference? I do, Wade said quietly. And I'm sorry. I am. But I need you to understand something too. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, his eyes steady, despite the rawness still visible underneath. Every single person who's ever known what I actually have has wanted something from it eventually. Business partners, old friends, Sarah. I've been burned enough times that the wall became automatic. I wasn't testing you because I doubted your heart, Emily. I was testing myself, testing whether I was even capable of trusting someone again. Emily let out a slow breath, feeling the anger loosen, slightly replaced by something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. And did I pass? She asked. You didn't just pass, Wade said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. You showed me something I'd forgotten was possible. You stood in that courtyard and chose a man you thought had nothing in front of the people who mattered most to your own reputation. He reached out and took her hand gently, the way he had the day before, the way that had already become in barely more than a day the single gesture she trusted most in the world. I don't want to hide anything else from you. Not the money, not the company, not whatever Sarah Whitcomb is planning by showing up here last night, because I promise you that woman does not do anything without a reason. Emily looked at him a long moment, weighing the fear still curling low in her stomach against the steadiness in his eyes, and finally nodded once. "Then show me," she said. "All of it. No more half-truths, Wade. If I'm going to be your wife, I need to know exactly what that means, the good parts and whatever's coming next." Outside, through the kitchen window, the black SUV's engine started low and quiet, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a phone Emily couldn't see began to ring the first small tremor, though neither of them yet knew it, of a much larger storm already gathering on the horizon. The phone rang again just after 10 that morning, and this time it was Emily's. She'd left it charging on the kitchen counter overnight, forgotten in the chaos of everything that had happened, and when she finally picked it up, she found 11 missed calls, all from the same number, all from the last 2 hours. Her mother's name sat at the top of the screen, glowing insistently, and something about the sheer volume of attempts sent a cold thread of dread through her chest before she'd even answered. "Mama, Emily." Diane's voice came through, ragged, thin, stretched so far past its usual composed register that Emily barely recognized it. "Emily, thank God you picked up. What's wrong?" Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Across the kitchen, Wade set down the mug he'd been holding and turned to watch her face, reading the alarm there before she'd said another word. "It's your father." Diane's breath hitched, and Emily could hear faintly the sound of her mother pacing, heels clicking against hardwood, a rhythm of pure panic. "Men came to the house this morning. Bank representatives. No, not the bank. Some kind of private lending firm with papers. Emily, with your father's signature on documents he swears he never signed. They're saying he owes almost $4 million. Emily felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. $4 million for what land development, Diane said. Something about a project Derek's been putting together. Derek said your father was backing it, said the Carter name was attached as collateral. Your father is screaming that he never signed anything, that he's never even seen half these papers, but Emily, they have his signature. They have the family seal." "Where's Kayla?" Emily asked, her stomach dropping further with every word. There was a pause on the line, and when Diane spoke again, her voice had dropped into something even more frightened. "She's with Derek. She called me an hour ago. Just for a minute she sounded strange. Emily, she sounded scared, and then the call just cut off. I've tried calling back a dozen times. It goes straight to voicemail now." Emily's hand had begun to shake. "Mama, has anyone actually seen her since last night?" "No," Diane whispered. "No, and your father's gone to Derek's office already. He wouldn't wait. He wouldn't listen to me. And I don't know what's going to happen when he gets there. He's so angry, Emily. He's not thinking clearly. At all." "Okay." Emily forced her voice to steady, drawing on some reserve of calm she didn't fully know she had until the moment demanded it. "Okay, Mama, breathe. I'm going to figure this out." She hung up and turned to Wade, who was already standing, already reaching for his keys off the hook by the door, his expression having shifted into something focused and controlled that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful, guarded warmth of the man she'd fallen in love with, but something harder underneath it, a version of him built for exactly this kind of crisis. "Tell me everything your mother said," he instructed in order, "and don't leave anything out." Emily relayed it as clearly as she could. The papers, the $4 million, Derek's land development project, Kayla's frightened phone call cut short, her father storming off to confront Derek in person without waiting for anyone. Wade's jaw tightened with every sentence. "Malik," he said, already pulling out his phone. The man from the SUV appeared in the doorway within minutes, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the same dark jacket Emily had glimpsed through the kitchen window earlier, his face arranged into the calm, unreadable expression of someone who had spent a career training himself not to react visibly to anything. "Sir, I need everything you can find on Derek Hayes," Wade said. "Business filings, land development permits, anything tied to a project using the Carter name as collateral. And I need to know where Kayla Carter is right now, this exact moment, and whether she's safe." Malik nodded once and stepped back out onto the porch, phone already pressed to his ear, his voice dropping into the low-clipped cadence of a man giving orders that would be obeyed without question. Emily watched him go, then turned back to Wade. "I want to go there," she said. "Now. To Derek's office to find my sister." "No." The word came out sharper than Wade seemed to intend, and he softened it almost immediately, stepping closer, taking her hands in his. "Emily, listen to me. I understand the instinct. I do. But if we go in right now, angry without knowing exactly what we're walking into, we could make everything worse." Denzel Derek, he corrected himself. "Men like that don't panic when you shout at them. They panic when they realize they've lost control of the story. If your father walks in there right now yelling accusations, Derek will just tighten his grip further. He'll hide whatever he needs to hide. He'll make sure Kayla says whatever he needs her to say. That's my sister. Emily said, her voice rising raw with fear now instead of caution. She might be in danger right now, Wade, and you're asking me to just wait. I'm asking you to let me find out the truth first, Wade said, holding her gaze steadily despite the desperation building in her voice. I have people who can move quietly, who can find out exactly what Derek's done, and exactly where your sister stands in all of it before we walk in, and give him any reason to cover his tracks further. I promise you, Emily, I am not going to let anything happen to your sister. But running in blind isn't protecting her. It's just satisfying our own fear. Emily pulled her hands back, pacing the length of the kitchen once, twice, her mind spinning through every version of the worst-case scenario. She thought of Kayla, infuriating, careless, cruel sometimes in the thoughtless way of someone who had never once had to consider anyone else's feelings before her own, but still her sister, still the girl who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms when they were children, still someone Emily loved, despite every ugly thing that had passed between them. I don't need the whole truth to help my mother, Emily said, finally, her voice tight. I just need to go be with her. Then go, Wade said. Go be with your mother. That I'll drive you to myself right now. But I'm asking you, begging you, actually to trust me on Derek. Give me a few hours. Let Malik do what he does. If your sister is in real danger, we will know within the hour, and we will move faster and smarter than your father charging in there alone ever could. Emily searched his face for a long moment, torn between the fear clawing at her chest and the steadiness in his eyes, the same steadiness that had stood beside her in a gravel courtyard the day before, while 200 people laughed and her own father disowned her. He hadn't flinched then. He wasn't flinching now. A few hours, she said finally. That's all I'll give you. That's all I'll need, Wade said. The drive to her parents' house passed in tense silence. Emily's phone clutched in her lap, refreshing a call log that stayed stubbornly empty of any word from Kayla. When they pulled into the long driveway of the Carter estate, a house Emily had grown up in, its manicured hedges and circular fountain, suddenly looking after everything more like a stage set than a home, Diane was already at the door, face pale and streaked with tears, wrapping Emily in an embrace so tight it nearly knocked the breath from her. He wouldn't listen, Diane said into her daughter's shoulder. Your father, he just left. He took the car. He wouldn't wait for the lawyer to even call back. Wade's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped back onto the porch to answer it, his voice dropping low, and Emily watched his face through the window, watched it shift from careful attentiveness to something graver, something that made her stomach clench even before he'd hung up. He came back inside a moment later, and the look on his face told her everything before he'd said a single word. Malik confirmed it, Wade said quietly. Derek's been using the Carter family name and forged signatures to secure loans from at least 3 private lenders. The figures are worse than your mother thinks, closer to 7 million, not 4. He hesitated, and Emily saw something pass behind his eyes, a reluctance to say the next part. And Kayla's phone has been in the same location for the last 14 hours. Derek's penthouse. She hasn't left the building once. Diane made a sound like something breaking. Emily felt her own knees weaken beneath her, the fear she'd been holding at bay finally breaking through in full. We have to get her out, Emily said. We will, Wade said. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice at all, only the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had already begun somewhere behind his calm exterior, building the plan that would bring the whole carefully constructed lie crashing down. Malik found him just after sundown in the small back office. Wade kept at the farmhouse, the one room in the house that actually looked like it belonged to a billionaire, its walls lined with monitors showing freight routes across 3 states, a single desk lamp, casting the only light in the canned room. Sir Malik said, closing the door behind him with unusual care. There's something you need to see before this goes any further. It's not about Derek Hayes. Wade looked up from the papers spread across his desk. Derek's forged loan documents laid out now in careful rows, the false Carter family seal photographed and enlarged until the flaws in its stamping were plainly visible. What is it? Malik set his tablet on the desk without a word and pressed play. It was a phone call, audio only pulled. Wade would learn later from a security review that had started as routine and ended somewhere Malik clearly wished it hadn't. The voice on the recording was distorted slightly by the phone's speaker, but there was no mistaking it. Tommy Reyes. I'm not asking you to give me anything I haven't earned, Derek. I know things about that company nobody else knows. Cash flow, the real number on his net worth, which contracts are shaky and which ones aren't. That's worth something to a man building a story around him. Derek's voice, smooth and unbothered, answered back. It's worth exactly what I say. It's worth Tommy. You give me what I need before the wedding falls through completely, and I'll cover the hospital bill. All of it. Every cent your boy needs for that surgery. And if I don't, then I imagine you'll be explaining to your wife why your son's surgery got pushed back another 6 months, while you figure out financing on a trucker's salary." The recording ended. Wade sat perfectly still for a long moment, the silence in the room pressing down on him like something physical. "There's more," Malik said quietly. 3 more calls over the last 6 weeks. He hasn't handed over anything critical yet. Near as we can tell, he's been stalling, giving Derek scraps, nothing that would actually damage the company. But he's been talking to him, sir, since before the wedding." Wade felt something in his chest go cold and very still. Not the sharp, immediate pain of betrayal, but something slower, older, a wound reopening along a scar he'd thought had healed a long time ago. Tommy Hilevry, who had slept in the cab of that same truck beside him during the worst winter of his life, who had loaned him $40 once, when $40 was the difference between eating and not eating for a week, who had stood in that courtyard yesterday morning and warned him about trusting the Carter family too quickly. The betrayal, when it came from someone that close, didn't feel like anger. It felt like the floor disappearing. "Bring him here," Wade said. "Tonight." Tommy arrived within the hour, and Wade watched him come up the porch steps through the office window, watched the easy, familiar way he moved, the way of a man who had walked into this house 100 times before, who had no idea yet that tonight would be different. He knew the moment he stepped into the office. Wade could see it happen, the way Tommy's eyes moved from Wade's face to the tablet still resting on the desk to Malik standing quietly by the door, and something in his expression collapsed all at once like a building whose foundation had finally given out. "Wade, sit down," Wade said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow that made it worse than shouting would have. Tommy didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, his big frame suddenly looking smaller than Wade had ever seen it, his hands opening and closing at his sides. "How long have you known?" "Since about an hour ago," Wade said. "Long enough to hear 4 different conversations between you and a man currently trying to steal $7 million using my father-in-law's forged signature. Long enough to hear you offer him information about my company in exchange for money." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, the first crack in his composure since Malik had walked through the door. "Tommy, you warned me about trusting Emily's family too fast. You stood in that courtyard and told me not to walk into anything blind. And this whole time, it's not what you think." Tommy's voice broke. He dropped into the chair across from the desk, his head falling into his hands. "God, Wade, it's not. I never gave him anything real. I swear to you, every single time he called, I fed him something useless, something that sounded important, but wasn't. I was trying to figure out how to get out of it without him going public with what little he did know." "Why didn't you come to me?" Wade's voice rose now finally, the anger surfacing after years of practiced control. 15 years, Tommy. 15 years I have trusted you with things I've never told another living soul. And the first time you're in trouble, you go to him instead of me." Tommy's shoulders shook. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, red-rimmed, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple guilt. "My son needs surgery, Wade. Spinal surgery. The kind our insurance won't fully cover, the kind that costs more than I make in 3 years. His voice cracked entirely, now breaking apart on every other word. "I was too ashamed to come to you and ask for help. You've already given me so much over the years, the job, the house, covering Danny's first hospital stay when he was born early. I couldn't ask you again. I couldn't be the friend who keeps needing bailing out. So when Derek came to me with an offer that didn't feel like charity, that felt like I was earning it instead of begging for it, you were selling me out," Wade said flatly. "That's what it felt like from where I'm sitting. I know." Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I know, and I hate myself for it, and I've hated myself every single day since the first phone call. I never gave him anything that could hurt you, Wade, I swear on my son's life, but I know that doesn't make it right. I know I broke something between us that might not fix." He put his face in his hands again, his big shoulders shaking with something that looked unmistakably like real grief. "I was so scared, man. I was so scared of losing him, and I didn't know how else to save him." The room fell silent except for the low hum of the monitors on the wall casting their pale blue light across Tommy's bent head. Wade stood by the window staring out at the dark shape of the truck parked in the driveway. The same truck, the one he'd driven to the wedding, the one that had carried him through every hard year before any of this. And he felt standing there, the full weight of 2 griefs pressing down on him, at once the grief of a friend's betrayal and the older, deeper grief of understanding with sudden and terrible clarity exactly how far desperation could push a good man to do something he never would have chosen otherwise. He thought of his own father sitting at that kitchen table years ago, choosing propane over a doctor's visit, weeping quietly because there had been no good choice at all. Only 2 bad ones and a child who needed him to pick faster than his conscience wanted to allow. Something in Wade's chest loosened slightly painfully, even as the anger still burned underneath it. "How much?" Wade said finally, not turning around. "Does the surgery cost?" Tommy looked up, startled by the question. "Wade, I'm not asking you to. I didn't ask if you were asking," Wade said. "I asked how much." Tommy told him the number, his voice barely audible, shame written into every syllable. Wade nodded once, slowly, still facing the window, still watching the shape of the old truck in the dark. He didn't say anything else for a long moment, and Tommy sat frozen in the chair behind him, clearly uncertain whether what was coming next would be forgiveness or the final permanent end of 15 years of friendship. "Go home, Tommy," Wade said finally, his voice quiet, exhausted, carrying none of its earlier fury. "Go home to your family. We'll talk again tomorrow." Tommy rose slowly, hesitated at the door, as though there were a dozen more things he wanted to say and no way to say any of them, and finally left without another word, his footsteps heavy and slow across the porch boards. Wade remained at the window long after the sound of Tommy's truck had faded down the driveway. His reflection ghosted faintly in the dark glass, a billionaire standing alone in a small farmhouse office surrounded by the wreckage of 2 betrayals in as many days, and beneath the anger, beneath the exhaustion, something else was already beginning to take shape in his chest. Not forgiveness yet, but the first quiet stirrings of understanding, the recognition that the line between loyalty and desperation was thinner than he had ever let himself believe, and that tomorrow, one way or another, he was going to have to decide which side of that line still mattered more to him, the wound or the friendship it had grown out of. Morning came gray and heavy over the farmhouse clouds, pressing low against the tree line, and Wade hadn't slept. Emily found him still in the office when she came downstairs before dawn. The desk lamp burned down to a dim amber glow. 3 empty coffee mugs lined up along the edge of the desk like small monuments to a sleepless night. "You didn't come to bed," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. "I had some things to work through," Wade said. He didn't elaborate, and Emily, sensing the particular weight in his silence, didn't push. He'd made the call at 4 in the morning after hours of pacing the length of the small office, after replaying Tommy's broken voice a dozen times in his head. "I couldn't be the friend who keeps needing bailing out," until the words had worn a groove into him deep enough that sleep simply stopped being possible. He'd called the children's hospital in Dallas first, the one Tommy's son was scheduled to have surgery at, and spoken with a billing coordinator who clearly had no idea at first exactly who she was talking to. By the time the call ended, the entire outstanding balance on Danny Reyes's spinal surgery, every cent of it present and future, through recovery and physical therapy, both had been paid in full, anonymously routed through a private family trust that carried no trace of Wade Sullivan's name anywhere in the paperwork. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't planned to. Tommy arrived at the farmhouse just after 9, his face pale and drawn, clearly bracing himself for a conversation he expected to end their friendship for good. Malik let him in without a word, and Wade met him in the kitchen where Emily had quietly retreated to the porch, giving them space, though she watched through the window without pretending otherwise. "I came to say I'm resigning," Tommy said before Wade could speak. His voice was flat, resigned, a man who had clearly rehearsed the words the whole drive over. "From the company, from all of it. You don't have to fire me, Wade. I'll go quietly. I just wanted to look you in the eye one more time and tell you I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not the kind of sorry that's trying to save my job. The kind that's just true." Wade studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, watching Tommy's hands twist together in front of him, watching the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Not the exhaustion of a man who'd betrayed a friend, lightly, but the exhaustion of a man who had spent 6 weeks, lying awake every night doing math that never came out right, choosing between 2 kinds of failure, and hating himself for both. "Sit down," Tommy Wade said again, the same words he'd used the night before, though his voice carried something different now. Tommy sat warily, like a man expecting the chair to be pulled out from under him. "I got a call this morning," Wade said, "from the hospital. Wanted to confirm some paperwork details for a surgery scheduled for next Tuesday." Tommy went very still. "What paperwork?" "The bill," Wade said. "It's been settled. All of it. Danny's surgery, the follow-up care, physical therapy through the end of the year." He watched the color drain out of Tommy's face, watched confusion war with something that looked almost like fear. "I made the call last night, before I even decided whether I was going to forgive you for the rest of it." Wade, Tommy's voice cracked entirely. "Wade, no, I can't let you do that, not after what You didn't ask me to," Wade said. "That's the point." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes steady on his oldest friend's face. "You didn't come to me because you were ashamed, Tommy. You thought I'd see you differently if you needed help again. You thought 15 years of friendship came with some kind of limit, some ceiling on how many times a man's allowed to be desperate before the people who love him get tired of catching him." His voice roughened. "That's on me too. Some of it. I built a wall around this money a long time ago because I was scared of exactly what happened with Derek, people wanting something from me instead of wanting me. But somewhere in building that wall, I think I made you feel like you couldn't come to me with the one thing that actually mattered. Your son. That's not a mistake I'm willing to keep making." Tommy put his head in his hands, and his shoulders shook, not with the composed grief of the night before, but something raw, something that sounded from the porch where Emily stood silently watching, almost like relief breaking apart into something else entirely. "I don't deserve this," Tommy said, muffled into his palms. "I don't deserve you doing this after what I did." "Maybe not," Wade said, and there was no cruelty in it, only honesty. "But I've spent a lot of years measuring people by whether they deserve things, Tommy. My father spent his whole life working land he never got a fair share of, for a man who decided he didn't deserve what he'd been promised. I watched what that kind of math does to a person. I'm not interested in doing it to the people I actually love." He reached across the table, gripping Tommy's shoulder once hard. "You made a mistake. A bad one. You should have come to me. But I understand why you didn't, and I'd rather spend the next 15 years making sure you never feel like you can't again than spend them punishing you for one bad 6 weeks. Tommy lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, and looked at Wade with an expression that seemed to Emily watching through the window like a man seeing someone clearly for the first time. Not the billionaire, not the careful, guarded friend who'd built an empire out of a single truck, but the boy, underneath all of it, the one who still remembered exactly what it felt like to be desperate and afraid and unseen. "I thought I knew you," Tommy said quietly. 15 years I thought I knew exactly who you were. Loyal, careful, generous when it counted. But I've never seen you do something like this. Not for someone who just betrayed you. You didn't betray me because you're a bad man," Wade said. "You did it because you were drowning and Derek offered you a rope that turned out to be attached to something worse. I know what drowning looks like, Tommy. I lived it long enough to recognize it in someone else." His voice softened further. "I need you now more than ever. Derek's still out there, still holding forged papers with Robert Carter's name on them, still holding Kayla against her will in that penthouse. I have a plan to end all of it, and I can't do it without the one person who's known me since before any of this was real." Tommy wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand, something steadying in his posture, now some of the old solidity returning. "Tell me what you need." Wade laid it out then, the plan he'd built through the long, sleepless night, threading together everything Malik had uncovered about Derek's forged documents, the fraudulent land development scheme, the private lenders who had no idea they'd been deceived, the gala scheduled for the Sullivan following week where Derek intended to publicly announce the very project built entirely on lies. As Wade spoke, something shifted visibly in Tommy, the guilt and shame giving way slowly to purpose, to the old familiar rhythm of two men who had spent 15 years solving impossible problems together. Out on the porch, Emily finally stepped back inside, drawn by the changed cadence of the voices in the kitchen, no longer heavy with grief, but low and focused planning voices. The sound of two men rebuilding something that had nearly broken, beyond repair. She caught Wade's eye across the kitchen, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond even the events of the last 2 days. She had watched him in the space of one conversation take the deepest betrayal of his adult life, and answer it not with punishment, but with a kindness so quiet and so absolute that it had remade the very foundation of the friendship it had, nearly destroyed. She thought of what he'd told her on the porch 2 nights before. "I've been running from that question for 10 years and understood watching him now that whatever wound Sarah Whitcomb had carved into him a decade ago, whatever wall he'd built in the years since to keep himself from being hurt that way. Again, something in this moment had cracked that wall open further than she'd yet seen. Not through grand declarations. Through a hospital bill paid quietly anonymously before dawn, for a man who had only hours earlier sold pieces of his trust to a stranger. It was, Emily realized, watching her husband lean across the table toward his oldest friend, the truest thing she had learned about Wade Sullivan since the moment she'd first met him spilling coffee across a table in a small downtown diner. He did not love the way most men she'd known loved, cautiously, conditionally keeping score. He loved the way a man loves who has spent a lifetime terrified of being unworthy of love himself, and had decided somewhere along the way that the only answer to that fear was to give more of it away than anyone had ever thought to give him. And somewhere beneath the fear of Sarah's return, beneath the growing danger surrounding Derek and her sister, and her father's forged signature on $7 million of fraudulent debt, Emily felt something in her own chest settle more firmly into place. Whatever came next, she thought, watching Wade and Tommy bend their heads together over the kitchen table. She had married the right man for exactly the wrong reasons the world would have chosen for her, and she had never once, not for a single moment, since regretted it. The building rose 40 stories above downtown Dallas, its glass facade catching the late morning sun in sheets of gold and silver, and Emily stood on the sidewalk beside Wade with her neck craned back, trying to reconcile the man beside her. The same man who'd cooked eggs in a modest farmhouse kitchen 2 mornings ago, who still wore the same scuffed work boots he'd worn to their wedding, with the letters etched in brushed steel above the entrance. Sullivan Freight Lines, corporate headquarters. "You own this whole building?" she asked. "Most of it," Wade said. "There's a law firm on the top 3 floors I've never gotten around to buying out. Kept meaning to. Never had the time." The lobby swallowed sound, the way expensive spaces always did. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A massive steel sculpture of an 18-wheeler suspended from the ceiling, as though caught mid-motion, frozen forever in the act of arriving somewhere important. A woman in a sharp navy suit rose from behind the front desk the moment the elevator doors opened on the top floor, her face breaking into a warm, genuine smile that told Emily this was not simple corporate deference. "Mr. Sullivan." She extended a hand to Emily immediately, without waiting to be introduced. "You must be Emily. I've heard so much about you, well, some of it." "He's not exactly forthcoming." She smiled wider. "Grace Whitman. I run day-to-day operations around here, which mostly means I keep this man from working himself into an early grave." "Grace built half of what you're about to see," Wade said. "I started this company with 1 truck and a loan I couldn't afford. She's the reason it didn't stay that way." Grace led them through the executive floor, and Emily found herself slowing at nearly every window, at nearly every wall. An entire corridor lined with black and white photographs charting the company's growth. The earliest image, a grainy shot of a single battered freightliner parked outside a gas station, the timestamp in the corner barely legible, and the most recent, a sweeping aerial photograph of a distribution hub the size of a small town, 40 loading docks and a fleet of trucks stretching to the horizon. 11 years, Wade said quietly, standing beside her in front of the wall. "From that truck to this. I don't look at these very often. Why not?" He was quiet a moment, his eyes tracing the progression of photographs like a man reading his own biography and finding parts of it painful. "Because it's easier to remember the hard years as a story that already ended well," he said finally. "Standing in front of the proof of how far it went sometimes, that just reminds me how close it came to not happening at all." Grace guided them into the war room. Next, an expansive space dominated by a wall-sized digital map of the country. Thousands of small lights blinking in slow, constant motion, each one representing a truck somewhere on a highway moving goods from one end of the nation to the other. Analysts sat at long tables beneath the map, murmuring into headsets, tracking routes and delivery windows with the quiet intensity of air traffic controllers. "Every light on that map," Grace said to Emily, "is somebody's job, somebody's mortgage payment. We employ almost 9,000 people directly, and probably 3 times that many indirectly, through contractors and partner fleets." She glanced at Wade, something proud and slightly exasperated in her expression. "This man still personally reviews the safety incident reports every single week. 9,000 employees, and he insists on reading every single one himself. Because every one of those reports is somebody who could have been my father," Wade said quietly, and Emily felt the words land somewhere deep, remembering what he'd told her. His father working land for a promise that turned to smoke, dying worn thin by decades in service of men who never once considered what his labor actually cost him. They ended the tour in Wade's own office, a room that was, Emily noted with something like relief, almost aggressively unglamorous compared to everything they'd just walked through. A plain wooden desk, no different from the one in the farmhouse office. A single framed photograph turned slightly away from visitors, and one wall entirely bare except for a small weathered strip of leather hanging from a nail. "What's that?" Emily asked, moving closer. "Part of a harness," Wade said. "Off my father's truck. The one he drove for Walton Carter, hauling cattle feed twice a week on top of everything else he did for that ranch." His voice had gone quiet, careful, the way it always did when the subject of his father surfaced. "I kept it because it's the only thing of his I have that actually came from that job. Everything else, the land, the promise, any real inheritance, disappeared. The day Robert Carter decided a handshake wasn't worth honoring. Emily turned to him slowly, something cold moving through her chest. "Robert, my father." Wade held her gaze, and she saw finally the thing he'd been carrying since the morning of their wedding. The thing Tommy had pulled him aside to say in the shadow of the porte cochere. The conversation she'd glimpsed but never fully understood. "My father was Robert's father's foreman," Wade said. 40 acres promised to him verbally for over a decade of work that built the foundation of everything the Carter family still has today. Walton Carter died before he ever put it in writing. Robert inherited the ranch and decided the promise died with his father. He exhaled slowly. "I found out about it the morning of our wedding. Tommy told me right before the ceremony, standing under that portico while your father was still inside deciding whether to disown you." Emily felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the same sensation from 2 nights ago when Sarah Whitcomb had appeared at the farmhouse door. The sickening vertigo of discovering the ground she'd been standing on was never quite as solid as she'd believed. "You knew," she said slowly. "You knew and you married me anyway that same day." "I knew and it terrified me," Wade said. "Tommy asked me straight out whether I was marrying you for love or for revenge. Whether some part of me wanted to walk into your family and make your father watch his own daughter choose the son of the man he'd cheated." His voice caught. "I told him it was love. I believed it. I still believe it. But I understand, Emily, if learning this changes how you see the last 2 days. If it makes you wonder whether some of what happened at that courtyard was really about us at all." Emily was quiet for a long moment, standing in the office of a man who owned 40 stories of downtown Dallas, staring at a strip of cracked leather hanging from a single nail, the only tangible proof left of a promise broken 2 generations ago. A promise that had shaped, without her ever knowing it, the entire trajectory of the man she'd married. "Does my father know?" she asked finally. "That you're Daniel Sullivan's son?" "I don't think so," Wade said. "It's possible he never even knew the foreman's name honestly. Men like your grandfather, men like your father became. They don't always remember the names of the people whose labor built their fortune. That's sort of the whole problem." Emily walked to the window, looking out over the city, over the vast, glittering skyline that Wade's company had helped to feed and supply and keep moving for over a decade, and felt something complicated settle into place inside her. Not anger at Wade, not exactly, but a dizzying recalibration of everything she thought she understood about how she and this man had found each other in the first place. "I need you to promise me something," she said, finally turning back to face him. "Anything. Whatever happens with Derek, with my father, with all of this, I need this to stay separate from what happened between our families 30 years ago. I need to know that when you help my father, if you help him, it's because it's right, not because some part of you wants him to know exactly whose son just saved him." Wade crossed the room slowly and took her hands, his eyes steady, though something raw moved behind them. "I can't promise you it won't be complicated," he said honestly. "I've spent my whole life measuring myself against what your family took from mine. That doesn't disappear just because I love you. But I can promise you this: every decision I make from here forward, I'll make it because of what's right and because of what protects you and your sister. Not because I need Robert Carter to feel small the way my father did." Emily studied his face for a long moment, searching for the smallest crack in that promise, and found instead only the same steady, careful honesty that had stood beside her in a gravel courtyard 2 mornings ago, refusing to let 2 laughing strangers convince her she wasn't worth choosing. "Okay," she said finally softly. "Then let's go save my sister." Behind them on Wade's desk, his phone began to buzz, Malik's name flashing on the screen, urgent, insistent, and something in the rhythm of it told them both, before either had answered, that whatever came next would demand every ounce of the fragile trust they'd just rebuilt between them. Malik was waiting for them in the war room when they returned to the farmhouse that evening, a laptop open on the kitchen table, its screen casting pale light across a face that looked for the first time since Emily had met him genuinely uneasy. Sir Malik said, glancing at Emily, then back to Wade. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Wade didn't sit. He stood behind a kitchen chair, both hands gripping its back, bracing for something he clearly hadn't anticipated. Emily stood beside him, her hand finding his forearm without conscious thought, the gesture already instinctive after only a handful of days. "We finished tracing the money behind Derek's forged loan documents," Malik said, turning the laptop to face them. "The private lending firm he's been working with, the one that issued the $7 million against Robert Carter's forged signature, has a shell structure 3 layers deep, standard for this kind of fraud. But when we cracked the final layer, we found something we weren't expecting." He paused, and Emily saw him choose his next words with visible care. "The consulting entity that structured the entire scheme, The one that advised Derek on exactly how to forge the Carter seal, exactly which lenders would move fast enough not to verify signatures properly, exactly how to time the fraud around a wedding announcement to minimize scrutiny. It's registered under a name you'll recognize. He clicked to the next screen. Whitcomb's Strategic Advisors. The room went very quiet. Wade's grip on the chair back tightened until his knuckles went pale. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been advising Derek for at least 8 months, Malik continued. Long before you and Emily even met, from what we can tell. The visit to the farmhouse 2 nights ago, it wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't nostalgia. Our review of her recent communications shows she was gathering information, reading the layout of the property, confirming details about your security detail's rotation schedule. She's not just an old flame who showed up out of curiosity, Wade. She's been running reconnaissance. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Wait, she said slowly. You're telling me the woman who showed up at our door, who said all those things about the old days, she's the same person helping Derek steal $7 million from my father? It's worse than that, Malik said, and something in his tone made Emily's stomach clench even before he continued. We pulled deeper into the origin of Whitcomb's Strategic Advisors. It was founded 9 years ago, 1 year after Sarah left you, Wade. He looked up, meeting Wade's eyes directly. Founded with startup capital from a man named Marcus Feld, an old business associate of hers who specialized back then in advising wealthy men on how to protect assets during divorce proceedings and hostile takeovers. Sarah didn't just leave you for money, sir. Based on the pattern here and on 3 other cases we found buried in old court filings, she built an entire career afterward on studying exactly how self-made men like you think, what makes them trust, what makes them vulnerable, what kind of test a man who's been burned once will run on the next person who claims to love him. Wade's face had gone gray. Emily watched something crack open behind his eyes, not simple anger, but something far more devastating, the particular horror of a man, realizing that a wound he thought he understood completely had in fact been engineered from the very beginning. She knew, Wade said slowly, exactly what I'd do. The truck, the wedding, all of it. His voice had gone hollow. She helped Derek build this whole scheme around the specific way I test the people I love, because she's the reason I test people at all. We believe, Malik said carefully, that the timing of your engagement to Emily wasn't coincidental either. Sarah has maintained loose contact with several people in your social circle over the years, nothing overt, nothing that would raise alarms. But once word got out that Wade Sullivan was seriously involved with a Carter daughter, someone with Derek's specific profile and Sarah's specific expertise would have recognized the opportunity almost immediately. A prominent family with old money and a hidden vulnerability. A billionaire fiancé known for guarding his wealth, obsessively likely to be distracted and off balance during a public dramatic wedding. It's a nearly perfect environment for exactly the kind of fraud Derek executed. Emily sank slowly into the kitchen chair, her mind reeling backward through every moment of the last few days. Sarah's cool, deliberate smile on the porch, the way her eyes had moved over the farmhouse like she was cataloging it. Pointed, needling comment as she left. He's not as simple as, he looks in that truck of his. Not a threat born of jealousy. A threat born of calculation, precise and cold. The closing move of a plan set in motion months before Emily had ever spilled coffee across a table in a downtown diner. She used what you told me, Wade said, his voice barely holding together now, about the wall I built, about needing to test people. She used my own wound as the blueprint for the con. He pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes, and for a moment Emily saw beneath the billionaire, beneath the careful composure that had carried him through a lifetime of hard rooms, the same devastated 26-year-old man who had once woken up to frost on the inside of a truck windshield and a fiancé's silence where love was supposed to be. Wade. Emily rose and crossed to him, taking his face gently in both hands, forcing him to look at her instead of the laptop screen, instead of the wound reopening in real time in front of him. Look at me. This isn't your fault. You didn't build a scheme to hurt yourself. She did that. She spent 9 years turning what she did to you into a weapon she could sell to men like Derek. She wanted to hurt me, Wade said, his voice raw. Not just take my money. Malik, why now? Why wait 9 years and then come after me specifically through Emily's family of all the marks you could have chosen? Malik hesitated, glancing at Emily as though seeking permission before delivering the last, heaviest piece of information. We found one more thing, he said finally. A recorded conversation between Sarah and a former associate 6 months ago. She talks about you by name. She says, and I'm reading this directly, he built an empire out of the exact wound I gave him. I want to be the one standing there when it finally collapses so he understands once and for all that leaving him was never the mistake. Loving him in the first place was. The room fell utterly silent. Emily felt Wade's whole body go rigid beneath her hands, felt the full weight of 9 years of buried grief and calculated cruelty land on him all at once in a kitchen that had only 2 nights before felt like the safest place either of them had ever stood. She's not just trying to bankrupt Derek's marks, Wade said slowly, understanding dawning across his face in real time, terrible and complete. She's trying to destroy this. Us. Everything I've built since her, because some part of her can't stand that I survived what she did to me and became something more than the broken man she left behind. Emily held his gaze, feeling her own fear settle slowly into something harder, something closer to resolve. She thought of her sister held against her will in Derek's penthouse. She thought of her father terrified and humiliated by $7 million of debt he never agreed to. She thought of the man in front of her, carrying a decade-old wound that a calculating, cruel woman had turned into a weapon aimed directly at the family he'd just begun tentatively to build. Then we don't let her win, Emily said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor still running underneath it. Whatever she wanted to prove by coming back, that you're still that broken 26-year-old man that love always ends in betrayal, we prove her wrong. Publicly. All of it. Derek's fraud, and her part in engineering it. Wade looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Grief still there, and fear, and the old familiar shadow of a decade-old wound reopened. But underneath all of it, something new beginning to surface. Something that looked unmistakably like the first real flicker of hope he'd allowed himself in longer than he could remember. There's a gala, he said finally, his voice steadying with every word. End of the week. Derek's planning to publicly announce the land development project, the one built entirely on your father's forged signature. Every lender, every investor, half the business community in Dallas will be in that room. He looked at Malik, then back at Emily, something hard and resolve settling into his jaw. We're going to be there too. And we're going to end all of it in front of every single person Sarah and Derek were counting on to look the other way. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom glittered with the particular excess reserved for men trying to convince a room full of money that more money was a safe bet. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across round tables draped in white linen. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and at the front of the room on a small raised stage flanked by 2 enormous display screens, Derek Hayes stood in a tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his cufflinks with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of consequences. Emily watched him from the edge of the room, her hand tight around a champagne flute. She had no intention of drinking, her eyes tracking every face in the crowd. Her father sat near the front, stiff and uncomfortable in his chair, clearly still unaware of the full scope of what tonight would reveal. Her mother sat beside him, dabbing at nothing beneath her eyes the way she always did when the room demanded a performance of composure she didn't actually feel. Kayla was not in the room yet. Malik's people had confirmed only an hour earlier that Derek's security had brought her from the penthouse under close watch, her phone still confiscated, her movement still monitored. But she was here now, somewhere behind the stage, waiting to be paraded out at the appropriate dramatic moment, a beautiful prop in Derek's carefully constructed performance. Ladies and gentlemen. Derek's voice carried easily through the room's sound system, warm and practiced. Tonight isn't just about land. It's about trust. About families building futures together. He gestured toward Robert seated near the front and smiled. My father-in-law, Robert Carter, has shown extraordinary faith in this project. Faith that I intend to honor with the largest private infrastructure development this region has seen in a generation. Applause rippled through the room, polite and uncertain, the sound of investors who had learned long ago to clap first and calculate risk later. Wade stood at the back of the ballroom, not yet visible to Derek. Dressed not in his work clothes but in a simple dark suit. No ostentation, nothing that announced wealth, the way the room around him did, but something in his bearing had changed. Since the wedding, something quieter and more absolute. Tommy stood beside him, solid and steady, the two of them having spent the better part of the week rebuilding piece by piece the trust that had nearly broken between them. Grace Whitman stood on Wade's other side, a tablet tucked beneath her arm, her expression carrying the calm, contained focus of a woman about to deploy something she had spent days preparing. Ready? Wade asked quietly. Ready, Grace said. Wade began walking. He crossed the ballroom without hurry, without theater, simply moving through the crowd, the way a man moves through a room he owns, and heads began to turn as he passed first a few, then more, whispers rippling outward ahead of him like water. Parting. Derek noticed the shift in the room before he noticed Wade directly, his easy smile faltering slightly as the murmuring grew, and when his eyes finally landed on Wade approaching the stage, something flickered across his face. Not fear yet, but the first thin edge of it. "Well," Derek said into the microphone, recovering quickly, his voice pitched for the room. "The truck and camel groom joins us. Should we pause for a photo?" A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, but fewer than the joke seemed to expect. "Good evening," Derek, Wade said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room had already gone quiet enough to carry it. "I don't recall inviting you," Derek said. "You invited my land," Wade said. The words landed hard and the room's murmur sharpened into something closer to silence. Derek's smile thinned. "Excuse me." Wade nodded toward the display screens behind Derek, still showing the glossy renderings of the proposed development. "That route your project depends on for access to the northern distribution corridor, the storage facilities near Carnes Ridge, the port access easement you've promised your investors." He turned toward Grace and she stepped forward, tablet in hand, connecting it to the room's display system. "All of it runs through land my company owns outright. You're selling a future built on infrastructure you never had rights to." The screens changed. Derek's glossy renderings dissolved, replaced by property deeds, easement filings, a detailed map overlay showing Sullivan Freight Line's land holdings across the exact corridor Derek's presentation had promised investors just minutes earlier. Robert Carter rose slowly from his chair near the front, his face draining of color. "That's not possible," Derek said, but his voice had lost its polish now, the first crack showing through. "It's very possible," Wade said, "because I own it." He looked out at the room, at the lenders and investors frozen mid-swallow around their champagne. "Just like I own the truth about the signature on the $7 million loan documents you've been circulating for the last 3 weeks. A collective intake of breath moved through the ballroom. Robert's hand found the back of his chair, gripping it hard. "Robert," Wade said, turning toward him directly, now his voice gentler but no less firm. "Did you sign those loan documents?" "No." Robert's voice came out hoarse, barely audible at first, then louder, driven by something that looked for the first time Emily had ever seen, like genuine fear rather than pride. "No, I never signed anything. I've never even seen half of what they're claiming." Grace pulled up the forgery analysis on the screen, the Carter family seal enlarged until the flaws in its stamping were unmistakable side by side with the authentic version pulled from decades-old property records. "The seal is a forgery," Grace said clearly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had built her career on exactly this kind of precision. "Independently verified by 3 separate document examiners. Mr. Carter's actual signature does not match the documents Mr. Hayes has used to secure loans from at least 4 private lending institutions represented in this room tonight." An older man near the front, one of the lenders, Emily realized, watching his face go rigid with dawning alarm, stood abruptly. "Mr. Hayes, you told us this project had the Carter family's full financial backing." "It does," Derek said quickly, too quickly, sweat beginning to show along his hairline despite the ballroom's careful climate control. "This is a misunderstanding. A family dispute that has nothing to do with—" "Where is my daughter?" Robert's voice cut through the room like a blade, and something in it made even Derek flinch. There was a pause, and then Kayla appeared from behind the stage curtain, one of Malik's security personnel, walking discreetly beside her, not restraining her but clearly having made sure in the confusion of the last several minutes that no one else could stop her from coming forward. She looked pale, exhausted, her green dress hanging slightly loose on a frame that had visibly thinned over the last week. "Kayla." Diane rose from her seat, one hand pressed to her mouth. Kayla didn't look at her mother first. She looked at Derek, and something in her expression had changed entirely from the woman who had leaned against a Rolls-Royce laughing at Wade's truck only days earlier. "He took my phone," Kayla said, her voice shaking but clear enough to carry across the silent ballroom. 3 days ago. He told me not to call anyone, said it was for my own protection, said the family's reputation depended on me staying quiet until the deal closed." She looked at her father. "I didn't know about the forged papers, Daddy. I swear I didn't know. But I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to get out." Derek's composure finally shattered. "Kayla, don't." What Kayla's voice rose now sharp with something that had been building for days, maybe longer. "Don't tell them the truth. I've spent a week locked in a penthouse listening to you make calls. I wasn't supposed to hear, watching you get more and more desperate as this whole thing started falling apart. I'm done protecting you." The room had gone electric now, whispers rising into open murmurs, several lenders already reaching for their phones, and Wade watched Derek's face cycle through calculation and panic in equal measure, watched him search the crowd for some avenue of escape that clearly wasn't there. "There's one more thing," Wade said, and something in his tone made the room quiet again immediately. "The consulting firm that structured this entire fraud, the one that advised Mr. Hayes on exactly how to forge the seal, exactly which lenders would move too fast to verify signatures properly, exactly how to time all of it around a wedding to minimize scrutiny." Grace pulled up the final document, the ownership records for Whitcomb Strategic Advisors, Sarah's name printed clearly at the top. A woman near the back of the ballroom rose sharply from her chair. Sarah dressed in deep emerald silk, her face draining of its careful composure, as every head in the room turned toward her. "Sarah Whitcomb," Wade said, and his voice for the first time all evening carried something raw beneath its steadiness. Not triumph, but the exhausted, hard-won clarity of a man finally speaking directly to the wound that had shaped a decade of his life. "You built this entire scheme around the exact way you knew I'd respond to it because you're the one who taught me to respond that way in the first place." The ballroom held its breath. Sarah's mouth opened some retort or denial, half-formed, but nothing came out. And in that silence, Emily watched her husband stand at the center of a room full of the people who had once laughed at him, finally free of the last, most carefully hidden wound of all. Not through revenge, not through cruelty, but through simple, devastating act of speaking the truth out loud in front of everyone and refusing to flinch. Security arrived within minutes, hotel staff first moving with the careful discretion of people trained to handle scandal quietly, followed shortly by 2 Dallas police detectives whom Malik had apparently notified hours earlier, waiting outside in an unmarked car for exactly this moment. Derek was escorted from the ballroom with his tie loosened and his composure entirely gone, protesting in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier polish. Sarah left more quietly, flanked by a second detective, her face a careful, controlled blank that fooled no one in a room that had just watched 9 years of calculated cruelty unravel in under 10 minutes. The ballroom didn't empty. Nobody quite seemed to know how to leave a room in which this much truth had just been spoken aloud, and so the guests remained clustered in small murmuring groups, watching the Carter family the way people watch the aftermath of a car accident, unable to look away, ashamed of their own curiosity, staying anyway. Robert Carter stood very still near the front of the room, his hand still gripping the back of his chair, his face the color of old paper. When he finally turned, it wasn't toward the departing detectives or the buzzing crowd. It was toward Wade. "You knew," Robert said slowly, "before tonight. You knew about the forgery, about Derek, about all of it. And you let this play out in front of every business partner I have. I gave you every chance to see it privately," Wade said quietly. "I sent Malik to your office 3 days ago with the same evidence you just saw on that screen. You didn't take his call." Robert's jaw worked. Emily watched something complicated pass across her father's face. Not quite the fury she'd expected, but something closer to the exhausted collapse of a man who had spent so many years mistaking pride for strength that he no longer entirely knew the difference. "Why?" Robert said finally, his voice rough. "Would you go to this much trouble for a family that disowned your wife 3 days ago?" Wade was quiet for a moment, and Emily saw him glance toward her, a brief, steadying look before he answered. "Because your daughter asked me to," he said, "and because I know what it costs, a family to lose everything to someone who was never honest with them in the first place." His voice dropped lower, carrying something that sounded to Emily's ears dangerously close to the old grief he'd carried into the ballroom that night. "My father worked land for your father for over a decade, Robert. 40 acres promised on a handshake, that disappeared the day you inherited the ranch and decided a verbal promise wasn't worth honoring." The color drained further from Robert's face. "Daniel Sullivan," he said slowly, as though pulling the name up from somewhere very old and very deep. "You're his son," Wade said. "Yes." The room around them had gone unnervingly quiet, close enough now that the remaining guests could hear every word, though none of them dared move closer or further away, caught in the gravity of a reckoning 3 decades in the making. Robert sank slowly back into his chair, the fight draining out of him all at once, replaced by something that looked for the first time in Emily's memory like genuine and unguarded shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear to you I didn't know who you were when Emily first brought you home. I want you to believe that much at least." "I do believe it," Wade said. "That's not really the point though, is it? Whether you remembered his name doesn't change what happened to him. What it cost my family for 20 years afterward." Robert looked up at him, and something in his expression cracked open entirely. Not performance now. Not the careful management of appearances he'd spent a lifetime perfecting, but real unguarded grief. "My father built half of what we have standing on your father's labor," he said, his voice breaking. "I knew that somewhere. I think I've known it my whole life and just never let myself look at it directly, because looking at it meant admitting the foundation under everything I built wasn't entirely mine to claim." He shook his head slowly. "And instead of ever making that right, I stood in a courtyard 3 days ago and called you unworthy of my daughter." "Yes," Wade said simply. "You did." Diane had begun crying quietly beside her husband, and Kayla stood a few feet away, still pale and thin from her week trapped in Derek's penthouse, watching the exchange with an expression Emily couldn't quite read: grief, maybe, or the slow, painful dawning of understanding just how much damage her own family's pride had caused to Wade's family, and to each other both. "Papa." Emily stepped forward finally, her voice steady despite the tears standing in her eyes. "This isn't about punishing you. Wade didn't do any of this to make you suffer. He did it because it was right, and because he loves me, and because," her voice caught slightly, "because somewhere underneath everything your family took from his, he still chose to save you anyway." Robert looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something in his face seemed to finally fully break open. "I called off your wedding in front of 200 people, he said, his voice raw. "I told you that you were no longer welcome in this family. And you're standing here telling me the man I humiliated just saved this family from ruin out of nothing but decency." "Yes," Emily said quietly. Robert's shoulders shook once, and for a moment, Emily thought her father, a man who had not cried in front of her since her grandmother's funeral 15 years earlier, might finally break down entirely in the middle of a hotel ballroom full of his own business associates. "I don't know how to make this right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 30 years of what my family did to yours. 3 days ago, standing in front of everyone I know telling you that you weren't good enough for my daughter. I don't know where a man even begins to fix something that large." "You begin," Wade said quietly, by not pretending it didn't happen. "That's usually where people go wrong. They want the apology to erase the debt instead of just acknowledging it." He extended his hand, not with warmth exactly, but with something steadier than anger. The particular grace of a man who had spent a decade learning the hard way that holding on to old wounds cost more than it ever protected. "I'm not interested in punishing you for what your father did, Robert. I've spent enough of my life letting old debts run my choices. I'd rather spend what's left of it building something better than settling scores." Robert stared at the offered hand for a long moment, and Emily watched something pass through him, pride still flickering weakly at the edges, but overwhelmed now by something larger, something closer to genuine humility than she had ever witnessed from her father in 28 years of knowing him. He took Wade's hand. Kayla moved closer, then her voice small and unsteady when she finally spoke. "I laughed at you," she said, looking at Wade directly for the first time since the ballroom's chaos had settled. "At the wedding, I stood next to that Rolls-Royce and I laughed at you like you were nothing, and the whole time Derek was." Her voice broke entirely and she pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. "I was so stupid. I thought the car meant he loved me. I thought the way people looked at us at that wedding meant I'd won something." She looked at Emily, tears finally spilling over. "You were the one who actually won, Em. You just didn't need everyone to see it to know it was true." Emily crossed the space between them and pulled her sister into an embrace, feeling Kayla's thin shoulders shake, with the particular grief of someone finally understanding in the wreckage of everything exactly how much cruelty she'd mistaken for confidence. "You don't have to fix this tonight," Emily said quietly into her sister's hair. "You just have to actually mean it when you say you're sorry, and keep meaning it tomorrow and the day after that." Behind them, Wade stood beside Robert, the two men, saying nothing further for a long moment, simply standing together in the wreckage of 30 years of unspoken history, finally painfully beginning to settle. Tommy watched from a few feet away, his own eyes wet, having spent the last week rebuilding his own broken trust with Wade, and understanding perhaps better than anyone else in that ballroom exactly how much courage it took for two wounded men to choose reconciliation over resentment. The ballroom slowly began to empty around them, the scandal already destined to become the story every person in that room would tell for years afterward. But none of that mattered now to the small cluster of people standing near the stage, family broken and rebuilt in the space of a single, devastating, cathartic evening, choosing deliberately and painfully to walk forward together, instead of carrying their separate griefs alone. Weeks later, the garden behind Pastor Whitfield's small church looked nothing like the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, and everyone gathered there seemed grateful for exactly that. Wildflowers grew in loose, unstructured clusters along a low wooden fence. Mason jars filled with candlelight lined a simple aisle of trampled grass. Someone had strung white string lights between two old oak trees, and they glowed now, in the deepening blue of early evening, like something borrowed from a memory, rather than staged for an occasion. Parked at the edge of the gravel lot exactly where everyone could see it on their way in, sat the old Ford pickup washed for the first time in years, a plain white ribbon tied loosely around its side mirror. Nobody had asked Wade to bring it. He'd simply driven it there himself the way he always did, and left it standing in plain view, no longer a symbol of a test he needed to run on anyone but something closer to a monument. A reminder of exactly where he'd started. Kept close now, not out of fear but out of gratitude. Tommy stood near the makeshift altar in a suit that fit him considerably better than the one he'd worn the first time. Danny recovering well, walking again with only the faintest limp that the doctors promised would fade with time. Seated in the front row beside his mother watching his father stand as best man with an expression of open, uncomplicated pride. Robert sat 2 rows back, Diane beside him, both of them dressed simply without the practiced polish of the wedding that had fallen apart in a gravel courtyard weeks earlier. Kayla sat beside them alone. She and Derek's engagement long since dissolved into criminal proceedings that would occupy the courts for months to come. But there was something steadier in her now, something that had begun slowly, painfully to rebuild itself from the wreckage of who she used to. Doesn't be. Pastor Sam Whitfield stood at the front of the small gathering, his reading glasses pushed up into his silver hair, watching Wade wait at the makeshift altar with the same patient warmth he'd carried into the chaos of the first ceremony. Weeks before, when Emily appeared at the far end of the garden, there was no orchestra, no procession of bridesmaids, no 600 flown-in roses. There was only Emily herself in a simple cream dress, walking unhurried across the grass toward the man waiting for her, and the quiet, unpolished sound of genuine applause rising up around her from people who had each in their own way been remade by everything the last month had cost them. Wade watched her come, and something in his chest, the same rope that had pulled taut the very first moment he'd seen her standing still in a laughing crowd, finally completely let go of its tension. When she reached him, he took her hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the whole garden holding its breath around them. "I have something I want to say," Wade said finally, his voice carrying out over the small gathering, rougher than usual, unguarded in a way none of them had heard from him before. "Not vows exactly, just the truth, since I owe everyone here more of that than I've given for most of my life." He looked out at the small crowd, at Robert, at Tommy, at Danny, sitting straight and healthy in the front row, at the old truck visible through the trees at the edge of the lot. "I spent 10 years building a wall around myself," Wade said. "I told myself it was strength, discipline, the kind of caution a smart man needs after he's been burned once. But it wasn't strength. It was fear wearing a nicer suit." His eyes found Emily's. "I made you stand in a courtyard and get humiliated in front of 200 people because some part of me needed proof you wouldn't leave the way someone else once did. That wasn't fair to you. It was never about you at all. It was about a wound I never let myself heal, because healing felt more dangerous than staying guarded." Emily's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "You didn't just pass some test that day," Wade continued. "You taught me that love isn't supposed to be something you have to survive a trial to earn. It's supposed to be the thing that finally lets you stop bracing for the next blow." He glanced at Tommy, who wiped his eyes without any pretense of hiding it. "And you showed me that loyalty isn't the absence of failure. It's what a person chooses to do after they fail. I nearly lost the best friend I've ever had because I built a life so guarded that even he didn't feel safe coming to me with the truth. That's on me as much as it was ever on him." He turned finally to Robert, whose eyes had gone red and unashamed, in a way that would have been unthinkable to the man standing on those hotel steps weeks earlier. "And to you, sir," Wade said. "I spent a long time thinking the only way to settle what your family took from mine was to prove I'd built something bigger than what I lost. I know now that isn't true either. The only way any of us actually settle old debts is by choosing every single day afterward to be better than the wound that was handed to us." Pastor Whitfield stepped forward, then his voice steady and warm, carrying the same simple ceremony he'd offered weeks before, under far more chaotic circumstances. "Do you, Wade Sullivan, take this woman not to prove anything to anyone, not to settle any score, but simply because you choose her exactly as she is, for exactly who you are, to love her, protect her, and let her love heal what still needs healing?" "I do," Wade said, and this time there was no test buried anywhere inside the words. Only the truth of a man finally fully choosing to be known. "And do you, Emily Carter Sullivan, take this man knowing everything now, the wealth and the wounds, both to walk beside him for whatever comes?" "I do," Emily said, her voice breaking gently on the words, "because I never needed the truck or the trucks. I only ever needed him." When Pastor Whitfield pronounced them married for the second time, the applause that rose up through the garden was nothing like the polite, uncertain clapping of a hotel ballroom. It was full-throated, unguarded, the sound of people who had watched pride nearly destroy 2 families, and had chosen deliberately to build something better out of the wreckage instead. Later that evening, as the string lights glowed gold against the darkening sky, and Danny chased fireflies across the grass with Tommy laughing somewhere behind him, Wade found Emily standing near the old truck, one hand resting lightly against its rusted door. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Emily looked at him for a long moment, really looked the way she had from the very beginning, and shook her head slowly. "Not one," she said. "Not the humiliation, not the fear, not any of it. It brought us here." Wade pulled her close, and for the first time in over a decade, standing in the quiet dark beside the truck that had once carried nothing but a frightened, hungry young man toward an uncertain future, he felt something settle inside him that had been missing for a very long time. He felt finally at home. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this: the people who deserve our trust are rarely the ones who arrive with the biggest car, the loudest promises, or the most polished performance. Real worth is quiet. It shows up in the way someone treats a stranger, in the way they carry an old wound without letting it turn them cruel, and in the courage it takes to finally set down a test they never should have needed to run in the first place. Wade spent years building walls to protect himself from being hurt again, but it was only when he let those walls come down, when he let himself be honest instead of guarded, that he actually found the healing he'd been chasing all along. And Emily reminds us that choosing someone for who they truly are before the world tells you who they're supposed to be is one of the bravest and most quietly powerful things a person can do. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness and honesty always outlast pride and appearances, we would be so grateful if you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today, and drop a comment below telling us which moment touched you the most. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. There are so many more journeys of love, resilience, and redemption still to come. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. We'll see you in the next video.